Hi, a lot of people have been interested in the stories I tell as an herbalist, and so I thought I would introduce the chief storyteller in my family, my father, who always told stories after dinner. It's right after dinner. There's my mother in the background. And after dinner here, he'd sit back. We'd all be sitting in our chairs, and he'd lean back and he'd tell a story about his ancestors or family or really amazing stories. So here is Frank H. Wood telling a story. I was thinking starting with you and your grandfather. It just seemed like that the archetypal story was his one toy.
Okay, right, great. Well, give a little background here. I grew up in a very small town in Kansas called Cherryvale, and my grandparents lived essentially next door to us in Cherryvale. And so this is my mother's father and mother. My grandfather, his name was Frank Henderson, Frank Downing Henderson, and I was named, of course, for him. That's why I'm Frank Henderson Wood. And he lived right next door to us. He was born, Matthew could correct me on this, but I believe he was born in Vermilion County, Illinois. He was born right along the
Vermilion River.
Vermilion River. Yeah. His family moved when he was very small to Peoria, Illinois. And then when he was about 7, they set out for Kansas. His father had fought in the Union Army during the Civil War, and soldiers who had fought for the Union could get land on advantageous terms. It was sort of like a GI Bill, but instead of getting an education, they got a quarter section of farmland. So they were traveling from Illinois to southeastern Kansas, where Cherryvale is located.
By covered wagon.
By covered wagon, right. And they camped, one of the places that they camped was in St. Louis. And there were a number of people who were traveling west back there. And my grandfather talked with one of the men who was in the camp, and the man very generously gave him a Jew's harp. Nowadays, they often call them a jaw harp, but the folk name was a Jew's harp. And a Jew's harp is I won't describe the metal shape, but it has a spring in the middle of it, and you flick this spring with your finger while holding the metal frame in your mouth, and it makes a buzzing kind of musical sound. Anyway, the important thing is that the little spring that you flick with your finger has a prong on it. And my grandfather had never had a toy that was not a homemade toy in his life. So this was just such a big thing for him. And he played it and so forth. And they traveled on then through Missouri, and they camped one night on the eastern bank of the Crystal River, I think it is, in Missouri. And he was put to sleep in the wagon bed, and hanging down right above him was a branch of a catalpa tree. And catalpas, have nice big leaves on them. And as he was going to sleep, he took his little Jew's harp and he pushed that prong that you use to play the Jew's harp. He pushed that into the leaf, and it just hung there on the leaf. And so he could go to sleep looking at it and so forth. And in the morning, they hitched up the horses, and the wagon was actually in the water before he woke up completely. And then he remembered his Jew's harp. And he wanted so desperately to go back that nobody would go back and get it because they were struggling to get the wagon through the river and up the other side. And he was just heartbroken. And my grandfather was not a person to tell a lot of stories about his early life, which had been very, very difficult. But that was something that he did tell me one time, and obviously something that even as he told it, you could just tell the sorrow and sadness that he felt for the loss of this Jew's harp. They moved on then into Kansas, and they didn't settle right in Cherryville, but instead they settled in a town that's a little to the east of Cherryville, a very small town that now has pretty much disappeared, called Dennis, Dennis, Kansas. So
yeah. And I remember, was it you or someone in the family said that he said when they arrived in southeastern Kansas that the blue stem grass was higher than a man on a horse.
Yeah, in the bottomlands along the rivers where there was more water, there were places where the blue stem grass was taller than the head of a man on a horse, and where traditionally the Indians, in order to be able to see what was going on when they were down in that, they would stand on the back of their horses and look over the grass to see. But seated on a horse, the grass was sometimes taller than your head, and it was all very, very wet. A lot of the prairie had a thick mat of grasses on it. And so when there was, reasonable amount of moisture, of course, now this is a fairly dry, fairly arid part of Kansas, not as dry as farther west, but still pretty dry. But when there was a decent amount of rain, why there was just this water down among the roots of the thing. So that it was until the pioneers came in with their teams of horses to break the sod, why it was quite a different ecological setup. The other thing, of course, is that along the river and creek bottoms, he told me there were relatively few trees when they first got there. That it was only gradually then that the trees spread up along the river. When I was there, all the rivers there were just a lot of trees.
Like it is today.
Like it is today. Yeah. Like it is today. So it was... The whole terrain was quite different. Now, of course, there were high areas, which were basically prairie, and so when you got up on top of hills or mounds, why it would be the prairie grasses, which were not as tall as the blue stem, the big blue stem.
Yeah.
And probably you had the shorter blue stem and so forth, little blue stem they called it, and so on.
Well, let's see. So he was the youngest son, and he was a twin, and you saw the family Bible. Do you remember those words? Yeah,
I don't remember the exact words, but he was a twin. His father, as I said, was a Union veteran, and his father, I think, probably came back from the war with malaria because of some of the description. Anyway, his health was never quite the same as when he was a young man. He came back from the war and found that his wife, who he had left behind, his wife with several children, 3 or 4 children, had died. He then married her older sister, who then she had the twin sons, my grandfather and his brother, but his twin brother lived only for a year. And his mother obviously had some education, because in addition to the fact that she writes beautifully in the family Bible, her handwriting is quite beautiful. She lists the days, hours, and minutes of that son's life. And she has that kind of a record of it, so that you can just tell it was one of the ways of her sort of expressing her grief and sort of memorializing in a way. But his father, as I say, was not well, and within a few years had passed away. So his mother was widowed, and the older half brothers and sisters were able to get work and went off and did other things. Many of them stayed around in that general area. Leaving my grandfather at home, I suppose when he was like maybe 11 or 12 years old, 10, 11, 12, he got a job with as a hired man on the farm of a neighbor, and he was always a hard worker. He just worked very, very hard. And the story then that he told me was that they had this man he was working for,
Mr. Jolly.
Mr. Jolly, yeah, was a well-to-do farmer and owned a steam engine that was used mainly to run a threshing machine and other farm equipment. You've probably seen these great big steam engines. I remember I was so startled to learn that these huge steam engines, they looked almost as big as a locomotive. I'm sure they're not as big as a big locomotive, big as a small locomotive. But anyway, they only are 15, 20, 25 horsepower. They're very low horsepower. So they're geared way down, and they drive very slowly. But they had big flywheels, and once you got them going, anyway, when they were having the harvest season, when my grandfather was working for this Mr. Jolly, my grandfather was helping a man who was in charge of running the steam engine. Well, it takes an hour or two to build up the steam in a steam engine. And this man drank too much. And so a morning or two, he didn't get up in time to fire up the steam engine. And so then when they were ready to thresh, the engine didn't have enough steam and power to run the threshing machine. So my grandfather said, Mr. Jolly called him, and Mr. Jolly said, Frank, you know how to run that steam engine, don't you? And my grandfather said, yes, I think I do. And so he said, well, it's your job from now on. And so they fired the other guy. And my grandfather, who I suppose was maybe 13 or 14 at the time, he took over, and that started the love affair of his life, which was always with steam engines. Huh. And he ran steam engines that powered the winch lines that were used in cutting forests out in the Northwest. He worked there for a while until the guy he was working for, he was telling him that one of the cables was beginning to fray, and this guy said, it'll be all right. And so, but then the cable broke. They were lowering these big trunks down the side of a mountain or something, and this cable whipped and just barely missed my grandfather. And my grandfather quit that day. He said that's I'm not going to take a chance again. So then he went and he worked running steam engines that pumped the water out of mines in silver and gold mines in Colorado. And there again, one of the reasons why he didn't have any trouble finding a job was that he didn't drink to excess. He drank only for medicinal purposes, he explained to me once. And so he always had whiskey around, and when he had a cold or something, he'd drink a little bit of whiskey every day. But he didn't get drunk. And so he could be counted on to keep those pumps, going in those mines and so forth. And so he loved steam engines, and then he ended up his life, the last probably 30, 40 years of his life, he worked on oil and gas rigs. Actually, it was cable tools, which was shallow drilling, and those were run by steam engines. Oh. And then about the time of World War II, they began to replace the steam engines with gasoline, basically automobile engines. And he continued to work on the rigs, but as far as he was concerned, he never really cared for automobile engines compared to the steam engines, which he just loved. Wow. So he was an interesting man. He used to tell me that if you were a real worker, he said, you wouldn't join one of these unions. He said, you'd be willing to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. He said, that's what I used to work. And he said, that's what I'm willing to work now. So, but he interestingly enough, the men that he worked with just, really loved him because he was such a good, honest person and so forth. Even though I'm sure they didn't agree with him,
Right.
that they would be happy working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. But then he continued working on the rigs until he was in his 70s. And as I say, they lived next door to us. And I can remember I happened to be there when a man who was kind of second in command on the rig, they called him a tool dresser, who had worked with my grandfather for a number of years and was very fond of him. And he came to talk to my grandmother. And he said, I don't know. He said, how we're going to tell him and how we're going to. But he said he's not safe on a rig anymore. He said, I'm not worried about mine getting hurt, but he's going to get hurt. And what he said was that my grandfather, his hand had slipped on a winch, and it pulled a pulley up to the top of the mast on the drill rig, and it broke loose then, and it fell. And this guy, Snow Wetzel, his name was, he said, he didn't even move. He said it came down and landed within a foot of him, and he had not moved. And he said he just doesn't have the reflexes that he used to have. He didn't use the word reflexes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, he didn't. Unfortunately, they didn't have to tell my grandfather. I don't know how it all worked out, but basically what the excuse given was that somebody from OSHA,
No, it was an insurance company.
It was an insurance company,
Yeah.
came out to look at the rig and asked the owner of the rig, how old is that man? And when the guy said, well, he's 73, I think it was he was at the time. And he said, well, we can't insure the rig, with somebody that old on it. And so then they told him he couldn't work on the rigs anymore. And he never, he was retired and so forth, but he never really got interested in anything else in particular. He just, after that, he sort of declined, and he died when he was about 86, I think, but he had been pretty senile the last 3 or 4 years before he died. And just one more story on him, again, showing this love of work. My parents had moved to California from their little town in Kansas. And within a year or two, my grandmother and grandfather moved out and again lived kind of next door to them, although not at first. And they were living my grandparents were living in an apartment. And by then, my grandfather was really quite forgetful and confused and so forth. And my grandmother had to keep the door locked and watch, because if he found the door unlocked, he would go out and he would stand on the corner waiting to be picked up and go to work. That's just shows what had meaning in his life. Yeah. And so forth. So I felt so fortunate to have known him. I didn't share his political point of view, which was extremely conservative. But
he thought that why didn't we bomb Moscow?
That's right. At the end of World War II, he was sort of talking politics, and I mainly just listened. But what he said was, why, if they would give me a plane and an atomic bomb, he said, I'd go over and I'd just bomb Moscow and we'd be done with those Russian communists. Now, he thought that Franklin Roosevelt was a communist. That was at that point, Kansas was basically a one-party state. You were either a Republican, or if you were a Democrat, from my grandfather's point of view, it was only because you hoped that you could get the postmastership in our little town or something, some kind of political appointment.
And I remember, let's see, his father-in-law, Jim Simpson. Yeah, he was a Democrat, and you asked your grandmother, "Why do you think he's a Democrat?" And what did she say?
Well, this came up one time. I was talking to my grandmother, and I said, "It's interesting, you know, how all of you were Republicans." And she said, "Well," she said, I don't say much about it." She said, "But actually, my father, Jim Simpson, who was dead by this time." She said, he was a Democrat. And I said, he was a Democrat? I didn't know there were any Democrats in the family. Oh, yeah, she said he was a Democrat. And I said, well, why was he the Democrat? Well, she said, I don't know, he liked to fight. and so I suppose that was the sure way to always find somebody who was willing to argue and fight with you. so forth. So you know, he anyway. It was again Jim Simpson. Actually, his family again. They had fought in the Civil War.
Yeah.
But there were of course a number of people in the on the Union side, Union soldiers, who were what the Republicans called Copperhead Democrats. They were not strongly anti-slavery and didn't think it was worthwhile to fight over slavery, but they would fight to save the Union. Yeah. And so that they were that apparently was his point of view.
Yeah, and of course, people that are outside of Kansas don't know the whole history of Kansas. It was a terribly destructive war inside Kansas with a lot of fighting and killing and lynching and burning of homes and things. So that feelings ran extremely high in Kansas. That's where John Brown came from. Yeah. So.
Well, what it was, of course, the Missouri River runs diagonally across Missouri, entering up the northwest corner of the state and then running, going out farther down toward the southwest. And Kansas City was at the junction of where the river it's now called the Kansas. It was always called the Kaw when I was growing up, where it runs into the Missouri River. And so settlers from the north who were coming to settle in Kansas had to cross the river there at Kansas City. And Kansas City was enslaved. Missouri was a slave state.
Right.
So basically they crossed through a corner of a slave state on their way into Kansas. And this was significant because when under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when a state voted to no longer be a territory but to be a state, the voters could vote it in as a slave state or a free state. Yeah. And so the North was trying to get as many people into Kansas as possible. And of course, when the vote was taken, Kansas was declared a free state. Yeah. Or it may have been that the war had already started, and so. But anyway, as you say, there was bloody fighting in Kansas.
Bloody Kansas.
That's right. Both before and during the Civil War, there was fighting in Kansas between the Northerners and the Southerners, the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Yeah. Should we go watch Grantchester?
Yeah, I do want to finish up a few things here. So your grandfather's father, Samuel K. Sanderson, he fought in the Union Army, and one thing we found in the notes your father wrote down was that your grandfather recalled, or maybe you heard this, that his father's teeth were worn down in a straight line across the front from ripping the canvas bullet bags open.
Well, they weren't canvas. I think they were some kind of heavy paper, but they did bite the powder. The powder for the guns came in a small packet, and to get that open, while a lot of the soldiers would just rip it open with their teeth, and then pour it. Well, of course, gunpowder is very gritty, and this stuff, it probably was dirt on these packages and so forth. But yeah, the story that I recall now, I haven't actually traced this down, was he fought in what they called the Western part of the war, and he one of the battles that they're pretty sure that he took part in was called Pea Ridge or something like that, and he was all down around the Mississippi Valley on the west side of the Mississippi. His brother fought with the Union Army and was in Sherman's army.
Oh.
And fought at Chattanooga, and then was on the march down to where they took Atlanta and so forth, and then back up along the Carolinas on the eastern side of the Appalachians and so forth. I don't know much about him. He settled somewhere else. Oh. He may have been the grandfather of the man that you were in contact with, what was his email address, was something like U.S. militia or something like that. Sounded again like one of these people who was sort of spoiling for a fight over anything that you wanted to fight about. So anyway.
Well, he was a nice enough guy, but I offended him. I think I suggested that, but one of the military records showed that one brother had shot another in the foot, and I suggested, well, maybe they didn't get along too well. That would have been kind of typical of, and he got kind of offended by that. And but a few other tidbits then. So, and Samuel Case Henderson. So that guy did help me find that he'd been in the Illinois regiment for 4 years. He fought the entire time of the Civil War in the Trans-Mississippi Western Theater, the Battle of Helena, and Pea Ridge. Mostly it was just chasing the Confederates who were outmanned for 4 years. And but then that was interesting about his teeth being worn down that way. And and then he died when Grandfather Henderson was 10 years old. And that's most of the stories, I think, the main ones. There's a few other ones we'll get to another time. So thank you. And we'll cover some other families. My mother's family were all the Unionists and Socialists. And we truly can say, we'll just give a little introduction. I may have to tell these stories myself, but nobody hates the communists more than the socialists. That's right, says my mother. Not even your grandfather. And we'll explain what that's all about. Okay. All right. Thank you, people. Bye.
Visit us at the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism.com.